Mexico have done a good job offering us ever more work to prove to us they're going to cut the fentanyl deaths.
He didn't want to say that he was going to get rid of the Department of Education. He didn't want to say he was going after Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. But those are the things that he is doing.
Education should be local. The more local, the better. You need parents and local school boards and superintendents to make the big decisions.
It's my assumption, again, cautiously optimistic, that things can move forward in a positive sense.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, changing course. President Trump signs a late-day executive order and makes a major reversal on his tariff policy, suspending the surcharges on some goods coming into America from Canada and Mexico. Dismantling the department. Education Secretary Linda McMahon has said it's the department's, quote, final mission. CBS News sources confirm President Trump is expected to issue an executive order to dissolve the Education Department, and we're tracking the timing on that move. And what about the economy? The Trump administration's massive federal cuts and rising economic uncertainty, the 1-2 punch that's helped to fuel a recession-level spike in layoffs. Let's start tonight with Scott McFarlane and Weijia Jiang on all of this. Weijia, you're at the White House. We'll start with you. So what are we seeing here with Trump backtracking on tariffs? Where do things stand?
So the latest, Caitlin, is that he just signed executive orders to put a pause, an exemption on some of the goods coming in from Mexico and Canada. And those are the products that are compliant with the USMCA, which is, of course, is the trade deal that all three countries participate in. So that's about 50% of Mexican goods and 38% of Canadian goods. And he also yesterday put a 1-month exemption on automobiles, too. And I think, what we are seeing in public is one thing, when the president speaks very toughly on tariffs. But we also know that behind the scenes, his Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, has been having nonstop negotiations with Mexico and Canada. And so what we don't know exactly is what these two countries put on the table, whether they offered any concessions to get Trump to, walk back at least a little bit. But there are obviously external pressures as well, including pressure from American companies and, of course, the stock market.
And Scott, some of the pressure, though not as tough, has been coming from some lawmakers on Capitol Hill, especially those Republicans who say, we don't like tariffs the way that you like tariffs. What's kind of the feeling up there?
I think the concern is most acute among those who have those automotive congressional districts. There are Republicans who have huge swaths of Michigan, huge swaths of Ohio, obviously, and these have direct impact on auto workers, on the providers, the contractors, the private companies that help serve the automakers, and, oh, by the way, the auto workers. But I think you get a more universal concern on tariffs when you hear the forecast from Canada that this could increase the price of cars by thousands of dollars. Now you've got a national issue, and this is where the pushback comes. I think for Republicans, from what we hear from our sources, the pushback is in the form of questions behind closed doors. From Democrats, the pushback is a little less subtle and more aggressive. But boy, when you start talking about prices, you hit the sweet spot of what Democrats want to be talking about in the first couple of months.
Yeah, that's a lot of money for an increase on something that most people need. Weijia, we know that lawmakers are watching the stock market. We know the president is one who definitely watches the stock market. And we saw Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick saying that the stock market is not driving their decision on tariffs here. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
The president wants American growth and American prosperity. Okay, and the fact if the stock market goes down 0.5% or 1%, it goes up 0.5% or 1%, that is not the driving force of our outcomes. Our outcomes are driven by, we want factory production in America, we want employment to explode in America.
And Weijia, I know you've done a lot of reporting over the past few days about what has gone into this as it's ever changing. But from what you know, I mean, how much is the stock market playing a role here?
Well, White House aides I've spoken to have not been able to deny that it is a factor. It may not be a driving factor, but it has a seat in the car when we're talking about tariffs. I mean, we're talking about Donald Trump, who before his political career was a businessman in New York City. And so, of course, he pays attention to Wall Street, and these numbers matter to him. But overall, he does insist essentially no pain, no gain. And he has said there has to be a disturbance, that farmers have to make an adjustment. But, you know, the question is how much? And that's what people at home want to know. How much are you asking us to pay in the meantime in order to get this, you know, vision accomplished of a manufacturing boom in the U.S. so we have American-made products instead of having to import foreign ones that have a tariff attached to them? Well, that takes years. It takes years when you're talking and asking about companies to just come to America and produce here instead. That's all fine and well, even if they do. Some companies have decided to do that, including Japanese automaker Honda for their next plant. But again, you can't just snap your fingers overnight and have a plant up and running. And so, you know, the stock market is one factor. There are certainly others as well, again, as Scott laid out. And it's, you know, people and complaints and pressure, not only from Democrats, but Republicans.
And Scott, another area, we've been talking about DOGE cuts to government for weeks now, but one area that could be impacted is the Office of Veterans Affairs. There are reports that thousands of jobs could be cut from that already pretty strapped agency. What's the significance of that? What have you been hearing? What's kind of the fallout?
This one lands differently than all the other many cuts at many agencies America is trying to navigate their way through. If you go back through the past 24 hours, you'll find all the local news clips members of Congress read. Beckley, West Virginia. What does this mean to the Beckley VA Medical Center? Buffalo Television Today. What does this mean for the Buffalo VA Medical Center and the clinics in Niagara Falls? And these are the things lawmakers are looking through because they recognize this is an agency that has already been under scrutiny for having a shortage of workers in some communities, a shortcoming in the services, either wait times are too long, clinics are too understaffed, or the services aren't up to par the way they should be for American heroes. So this one just lands differently. And I think based on what you're hearing from your congressional sources, and we are hearing from ours, is that this one just climbed its way to the top of the priority list because it can impact things not next year or next month, but in the next few days.
Yeah, and even federal workers may not elicit the kind of sympathy that they might want, but veterans sure do across the board. We'll keep an eye on that. Scott McFarland and Weijia Jiang, thank you so much. And turning to the Middle East, where Hamas says it will only free hostages in exchange for a lasting ceasefire with Israel. This in response to President Trump issuing what he described as a, quote, last warning to the militant group. CBS News foreign correspondent Deborah Patta has the latest from East Jerusalem.
U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff said recent talks with Hamas were aimed at getting the hostages home. He stressed the release of American captive Idan Alexander is a top priority for the Trump administration. This comes after President Trump warned Hamas that not a single member would be safe if they did not free the hostages. He didn't stop there. He also threatened the entire civilian population of Gaza, saying if they held hostages, they would be dead. A Hamas official in Gaza, Mushir al-Masri, accused Israel of delaying the ceasefire deal by introducing new terms and failing to engage in meaningful negotiations to end the war permanently. Al-Masri said Hamas is not looking to run a post-war Gaza. It just wants to ensure a Palestinian state. And as for disarming, a key Israeli demand, he said Hamas will not drop their weapons until there's freedom. Witkoff said he will travel to the region next week with stops planned in 4 countries. Back to you.
Deborah Patta, thank you. With hurricane season just a few months away, DOGE makes cuts to vital weather service operations. How plans to gut NOAA are raising public safety fears. Next, we'll speak with the man who led the agency under President Biden. You're watching America Decides. Hundreds of staffers at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, known as NOAA, have found themselves the latest target of the Trump administration's efforts to cut back the federal workforce, a move that has many in storm-prone regions like Louisiana concerned.
What is the effect going to be on the locals? What is it going to do to them? How is it going to affect them in their lives, in their daily life, or when storms come up?
More on this, let's bring in Rick Spinrad, who served as the administrator for NOAA during the Biden administration. Rick, great to see you. Thanks so much for being here. So up until a few weeks ago, really, you were in charge of NOAA. What is your reaction to these cuts?
Disturbed, obviously, surprised to a certain extent, because it reflects a real ignorance, if you will, of the value of fundamental information about weather and ocean currents and everything else that NOAA's responsible for. So I was surprised at how misguided and indiscriminate these kind of cuts have been.
I think everybody has heard of NOAA. They use NOAA in their everyday lives. They may not know it. What's kind of the impact here for just regular people?
I used to talk about NOAA's work affecting lives, livelihoods, and lifestyles. So think of that in terms of safety. Obviously, weather, when you have extreme events like, by the way, the tornado outbreak in West Texas, which basically the forecast was compromised yesterday because the network support, the people who did that, had been fired. So the forecasters in the Dallas-Fort Worth forecast office couldn't tell people about those tornadoes that were coming in towards Abilene with the same kind of skill that they would have before. People in the southeast part of the country right now, hey, we're heading into hurricane season. And we know now that because of the cuts that were made, several flight directors for NOAA's hurricane hunters were terminated. That means NOAA will most likely not be able to fly with the same operational tempo to provide the information that gives the quality of the forecast, that gives the track and intensity for when those hurricanes are going to make landfall, where they're going to hit, how intense they will be.
That seems like it would very much complicate storm preparation efforts.
Absolutely. We worked closely with the emergency management community, who relied heavily on 3- and 4-day forecasts to determine where to mobilize and how to mobilize. If we cannot give them the accuracy of the forecast because we've lost not just the ability of the hurricane hunters, but the people who are operating the satellite facilities for NOAA, the people who are going to sea to collect data at sea, all of those capabilities are compromised. And that means the emergency management community has got to distribute resources in places where they may not be sure they're going to have to deploy there. But if you don't have the forecast, you can't do it as accurately as we did before.
Yeah, and speaking of forecasts, we were talking earlier about how everybody thinks, okay, well, I can just get the weather on my phone app or however you check about that. Would that still be the case?
So those apps are great. I probably have half a dozen of them on my phone. They are all based on data and information that comes from NOAA, from the National Weather Service. So it's like the data feeding those apps won't be there anymore. So you'll still have the app, but the quality, the delivery of the information on it, you will notice a degradation of the products you get on those apps almost immediately because the data just are not coming in.
It just wouldn't be there.
That's right.
So since you ran NOAA, you know, you can argue that there are cuts to be made across the federal government. There is support for, you know, making things run more efficiently. In your view, are there areas where NOAA could be slimmed down a bit?
So the first thing I would say is the most important thing that I considered was less the efficiency, more the effectiveness. I cared more about whether a forecast was accurate than asking how much did it cost to produce that forecast. The other thing is NOAA was already understaffed when I was there. NOAA had a staff of about 12,000 and almost the same number of contractors working side by side with NOAA employees. So taking these cuts of hundreds or thousands of staff at NOAA is adding insult to injury in terms of already starting at a barely acceptable level of staffing.
So you, in your view, you needed more support?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is going completely the wrong way.
Are there other kind of real-world impacts for people that would be felt almost immediately? So one of the other responsibilities most people don't realize NOAA has is space weather forecasts. The geomagnetic storms that cause northern lights, that's great, but they also
impact GPS, they impact electrical grids, they impact communications. We had one last May. We had a real bad one. Most people didn't know it because NOAA had predicted it with enough lead time that the power companies could condition their grids, the airlines could redirect the airplanes, and all of these things were accommodated. People have been removed from that office as well. So if we have another geomagnetic storm, and we will, we can expect to have degradation of services. We can expect power grids may go down. We may expect that our GPS doesn't work as well. People will see that kind of impact immediately.
Yeah, it's amazing to think of how much is so accessible to us and we don't quite understand where all that information comes from.
That's right. And people are getting it for 6 cents a day.
Amazing.
That's the amazing thing.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, we will talk to you a lot over the course of all of this, and thank you so much for your insight and perspective.
Your attention.
We appreciate your time. Thank you. And many of President Trump's early executive actions impact the LGBTQ community. One group is working to bolster representation across the sexual orientation spectrum from City Hall to Capitol Hill. We'll speak with their CEO next on America Decides.
Now I want Congress to pass a bill permanently banning and criminalizing sex changes on children and forever ending the lie that any child is trapped in the wrong body. This is a big lie.
Welcome back to America Decides. As President Trump targets transgender rights, we're seeing more LGBTQ plus representation at the ballot box. The Victory Fund tracked over 1,000 candidates who ran for local, state, or federal office in 2024, and that's up slightly from 2020. The president and CEO of the Victory Fund, Evan Lowe, joins us now, and he was actually just named to this position this week. So, Evan, great to see you. A lot to get to here, but congratulations on your first week in your office. So you've been working, your group has been working to have more representation in federal office, but also local office as well. And I'm wondering how you're approaching that mission.
Well, we are so privileged to have the opportunity to serve. We have close to 1,500 openly LGBT elected and appointed officials across the country, from governors, members of Congress, to townships and everywhere in between. Members of our LGBTQ plus community are ready to serve. And if anything proves that, now is a critical period of time in which we are being legislated out of existence. We refuse to stay silent. So the call to action is very clear, and people are ready to serve.
And have you seen more people come to you and say, I'm looking to run for office?
Yeah, it's been incredible. We at the Victory Fund fundamentally help to elect and appoint openly LGBT people in answering that call for service. Countless calls and correspondence from all across the country of LGBTQ candidates and individuals calling us, asking us, I am thinking about running for governor, United States Senate, school board, open space districts, and everywhere in between. And so what that means to me and our community is that we refuse to stay on the sidelines. We see the sense of urgency, and we must participate.
The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, is the highest-ranking LGBTQ official in the nation's history. And I'm wondering how much that matters to you. Does that change your approach at all?
Well, I'm so glad that you recognize the fact that representation matters, and this is not about partisanship at all. The previous Transportation Secretary, and Pete Buttigieg, is also equally important. So we see history makers. We're hopeful that we can change hearts and minds. And, you know, there is this rhetoric and this narrative that LGBT people are seen as a liability, when in fact, what we talk about, as Secretary Bessent talks about, trade. Previous Secretary Pete Buttigieg talks about transportation. Mark Takano, Congressman, talks about Veterans Affairs. Sarah McBride, Congresswoman, talks about the price of eggs and lowering the cost. Mayor of San Diego, Todd Gloria, talks about affordable housing, and everywhere in between. And so when we think about individuals serving with distinction, they're running to better the lives of everyday Americans.
And are you working to recruit more Republicans?
Absolutely. We believe that service is important, and I'm hopeful that Secretary Bessent also can be a reflection that this is also can change hearts and minds. When we look at the history, this has traditionally been along various fault lines of party affiliation. But the fact of the matter is, we recognize love is love, and we must respect human dignity, especially in this period of time.
And how would you rate how the Democratic Party is protesting what the Trump administration is doing when it comes to these issues?
Well, I think what is important to recognize is that regardless of party affiliation, we must speak out. When you see something, say something. And going back to that of our authentic lives as openly LGBT individuals, we do not have the luxury of staying silent. And that's why we lead by example, by demonstrating empathy and grace and protecting the most vulnerable in our communities. And that's why we speak out so loudly about protecting the most vulnerable and helping to ensure that we have equality and equity all across the board.
And you mentioned Congresswoman Sarah McBride, the first openly transgender woman member of Congress. Do you see her campaign as a roadmap for others, or perhaps potential candidates that you're talking to? Do they see her campaign as a roadmap for them?
That is fundamentally the mission of the Victory Fund, to invest in everyday Americans within the LGBTQ community and to ensure that we have a pipeline and a pathway that the history makers, whether or not you are United States Senator Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, making sure that we lead with distinction and providing the blueprint, because the fact of the matter is it's also a very perilous time for members of the community to live authentic lives, because there may not be the type of protections that exist in their communities, in their states or in their local neighborhoods. And that's why, in spite of that, we encourage the opportunity for us as Victory Fund to invest and say, we will be with you every step of the way.
All right. Well, Evan Lowe, thank you so much. We will stay tuned. We appreciate your time. Thanks for being here. And the House censures Congressman Al Green for heckling President Trump during his speech to Congress this week. The chaotic scenes as he receives his official scolding. A reporter panel has more on that and the day's news. You're watching America Decides.
The central thing that President Trump was pushing for in his election was economic security, right? Was changing the economy, was making things more affordable for people. And on that very basic principle, he is just not meeting the mark by any standard.
That was Michigan Democratic Senator Elissa Slotkin on CBS Mornings in her first interview since delivering her party's response to the president's joint address. Let's bring in our power political panel of Sabrina Rodriguez and Finn Gomez. Sabrina is national political reporter for The Washington Post, and Finn Gomez is our executive director of White House and politics coverage. Great to have you both with us today. Thanks so much. Finn, let's start with Senator Slotkin, who used to be a House member, now a senator. I mean, she is so interesting because she was elected on the same ballot as Donald Trump in Michigan. So it kind of makes sense why Democrats chose her to give this address. I'm wondering kind of what the feedback has been on this address. Are people paying attention to it? Have Democrats kind of said, look, this is kind of where we want to go? What do you make of her address?
Well, I spoke to a lot of Democrats, actually, who gave just really positive reviews about her rebuttal to the president's address the other night. Senator Ruben Gallego from Arizona, who also won in a state that Trump won, are this new face of the Democratic Party, many think, within their own party. They represent this sort of center-left, but not just center-left. It's like they're meeting people where they are. They're talking about issues that Trump won on in a new way, and I think that that's what she did, also representing many of the same ideals of the Democratic Party, but at the same time not speaking past most voters, if you will. And that's the feedback that I've received. And I think that what we saw that night and also in that interview showcases someone who is becoming a rising star.
Yeah, you had that official rebuttal, and then you had other rebuttals from members of Congress in the chamber there. I mean, Al Green, everybody now knows he interrupted the president, got kicked out of the chamber. Today, he was officially censured by the House, including from some Democrats, Sabrina, who supported that measure. I know you've got some reporting on this. What have you been finding?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we saw between Tuesday and today's vote on the censure just shows the rift within the Democratic Party. We saw it on display in just how how much the variety of responses we saw to Trump's address on Tuesday. You know, what we saw at 11 p.m. after Trump's speech from Slotkin is not necessarily what we saw throughout the night in terms of the reaction from people who were in the chamber. You know, you saw a variety, the paddles that have been mocked very much on social media that some Democrats held up saying Musk steals, save Medicaid. There were some people who walked out. There were some people who didn't show up at all. There was folks like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, where she decided instead, you know, she didn't want to be there in person and she was going to engage with her followers on social media instead. So there's been that range of responses, and it sort of all came to the culmination today of that censure vote, where it was a question for some Democrats of, okay, are we going to stand with Congressman Al Green, or are we going to condemn this? And for the 10 that voted, you know, in favor of the censure, one of the things we've heard from those who have spoken up already about why they made that decision was sort of this feeling that they might not support Donald Trump, but at the end of the day, they support the institution. They want to preserve the integrity of what should happen on that night, on the way that things should work, have still respect for the office of the president, even if they don't necessarily agree with that person in office.
Yeah, it's interesting. You kind of have these two images, one of Al Green, one of Slotkin. We'll see kind of how voters across the country interpret that as time goes on. Finn, I do want to talk about Trump's efforts to dismantle the Department of Education. He's made no secret about this. I mean, we all covered him on the trail. He said this over and over again. And he's not the first Republican to want to get rid of the Department of Education. But we know he's going to sign an executive order. What do we know about what he wants to do here?
Yeah, well, we reported this morning that the president was essentially preparing an executive order that would direct his new Education Secretary, Linda McMahon, who we know from his last time in office, and to essentially start the process of dismantling the Department of Education. As you said, CHB, you know, this has been a long target of conservatives going back to like the Reagan era. So there's nothing new on that front. But however, like you reported, and some excellent reporting, by the way, CHB, on how they essentially dismantled USAID. There was essentially, that was the pathway that they were going to do here. Today, it seemed like they were walking it back, that it wasn't going to happen today as we thought it might happen. But he was asked about it just a little while ago in the Oval Office, where he essentially said if he's had second thoughts about this, and he said, no, I want to bring the schools back to the states. I've said it 100 times, so there's no change there.
That's interesting, Finn, and I'm glad you brought that up because Trump talks so frequently during the day, which is great. We hear from him a lot, which is great, but oftentimes we don't get that in real time. So I'm glad you brought that reporting to us. Sabrina, I mean, Republicans in Congress are all for this effort, but in order to completely abolish the agency, it has to go through Congress. I'm curious kind of what you make of this discussion and whether it would actually happen.
I mean, the reality is that to abolish an agency like this, first, it's unprecedented. This has not happened. Of course, that does not deter Donald Trump from trying to do this. And I think right now we're seeing this conversation happening far more in earnest than we've seen in administrations past, even if it is something that Republicans historically wanted, because Donald Trump is not trying to follow the rules here. Donald Trump is trying to be aggressive, make very clear what the agenda is. This is something he talked about countless times on the campaign trail. And like he said today, he's repeated himself many times on it. But the reality is this is something that requires congressional approval. This is something that the Senate would have to get 60 votes. And the reality is that this is not something that Democrats are supportive of. So to see a world in which that gets the 60 votes necessary, we're not there yet. Now, can Trump do a lot of things to gut the department, to really dwindle its power, to dwindle what exactly it does in its mandate? Absolutely. He can do that the same way that we've seen him do it with USAID, and I think there's an open question of how he will do that in the months to come.
Yeah, that is the big question about what exactly it looks like. And we know this president also is fine to challenge a lot of legal, kind of invites legal challenges as well. And then just quickly on tariffs, just quickly from both of you. I mean, it seems like everyone is trying to figure out where the president is on this. What are the consequences?
There's so much volatility right now. You know, we've seen it with a lot of things in Trump's agenda, but the reality is that for U.S. businesses, there's so much uncertainty. You know, today he announced a 1-month exemption for Mexico and for Canada for goods that are compliant with USMCA. For Mexican goods, that's about 40% to 50% of what we buy from Mexico. And in Canada, it's something closer to 38%. But these are all like very complicated specifics. So for a lot of companies, they're grappling saying, okay, how do we change our supply chains? What exactly do we need to be doing? It's a 1-month exemption. Is it something that he might do going forward? Is he going to end up rolling back the tariffs? There's so many questions. And with Trump just kind of on the fly making these changes, it really creates an unpredictability for those companies and ultimately can mean that we're going to be paying more when we go to the grocery store and when we go and shop.
Yeah, and Republicans seem to want to give him some latitude here. They know he likes the word tariffs. They're just wondering
it's his
how he
favorite
uses
word,
it.
right? But I will say, just to add to what the Duchess of Hialeah said on that volatility, it is like, do not look at your 401k. I did that mistake earlier today, and it was a little bit of my eyes still hurt from seeing it. But I will say, look, I mean, he was asked about that again. Is that playing a role in his decision to sort of walk this back? He said, no, of course not. But we do know he is getting pressure not only from CEOs, as we know, from the top big 3 automakers, but also from Republican senators in those agrarian states that's saying our agribusiness could be hurting here. So there's a lot of trepidation. We heard Senator Paul say something about that today. So will he proceed forward? He not only did he campaign on tariffs, he's been talking about it for decades also.
Exactly. Nobody can be surprised by it, but they're wondering how exactly he'll use them. Finn and Sabrina, thank you so much. Stay tuned. We will follow up with you throughout this year as we go through the news. But now we're going to Brussels, where President Zelensky joined EU leaders for an emergency summit on how to bolster Ukraine's security. The Ukrainian president telling those gathered that he hopes to have a, quote, meaningful meeting with the United States next week. And this, of course, comes as the White House says Zelensky has offered to sign a minerals deal. So for more on this, let's bring in CBS News senior national security correspondent Charlie D'Agata joining us from the Pentagon. Charlie, good to see you. So what more can you tell us about this emergency EU meeting today?
Yeah, Caitlin, in essence, this is Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky going to Brussels asking the EU for a lifeline in the absence of support from the United States. He's drumming up support from members of the European Union for commitment. Now, so at the moment, 27 members of the EU at least promised to fill that void that would see these partners, these individual countries, increase their military spending by loosening restrictions. So in theory, that would loosen up like $700 billion, which would dwarf any contribution that the United States has made. But that's not in the bank, right? That's not a check. And this comes after, as you mentioned, this disastrous visit to the White House last week. Zelensky has called that regrettable. He said he's willing to restart talks with the U.S. And as he said, he says those talks will take place in Saudi Arabia next week.
So we know that they're willing to sign this minerals deal. I mean, the big question everybody has around town, at least here, is do we know where the administration stands right now on this?
Yeah, so President Trump was very telling in his address to Congress the other night on Tuesday that Zelensky had actually declared he's still willing to resurrect that deal for rare earth minerals. He actually said it came in a letter that day. Zelensky posted on social media he was ready to sign that deal and talk peace. But it's not clear yet. Maybe it's part of the negotiation, terms of the deal. But if it was the same one that they were discussing before, like last week, before things went south, that would see the Ukrainian government contributing like 50% of its revenues from their natural resources to like a U.S.-Ukraine fund. Part of that's like for reconstruction, and then also part of, I guess you'd call it payback for U.S. support for the war. But what is still an open question, and I don't think it's been resolved yet, is what Ukraine gets out of the deal, because they're looking for security guarantees. And that is an open question. I don't even think that was resolved last week.
Yeah, and that comes, of course, as the U.S. has paused funding, and the CIA has confirmed that they've stopped intelligence sharing with Ukraine as well, at least for now. So a lot to stay tuned to. Charlie D'Agata, thank you so much for bringing it all to us.
Thanks, Caitlin.
And layoffs across the U.S. soared to their highest level in 25 years. How DOGE actions are fueling the jobs cut surge. You're watching America Decides. And welcome back to America Decides. Layoffs in February were fueled by Department of Government Efficiency's cuts. Employers cut over 172,000 jobs last month, according to the firm Challenger, Gray & Christmas, and that's the highest number of layoffs per month since the height of the pandemic in July of 2020. CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady joins us now to make sense of this all. Kelly, good to see you. So how bad exactly are these numbers?
They're pretty bad, Caitlin. Just to give you some context, this was a 245% jump versus the layoffs numbers that we saw in January. Now, February, there is always a bit higher traditionally than what you see in January, but it was a 100% jump versus what we saw in February layoffs in 2024. So this is a big number. And then I was going back through the report's history. They've been looking at this space for about 30 years. There were 11 times before where there were numbers that were higher than what we saw last month. All 11 of those were when the U.S. was in a recession. So that kind of gives you some context that these numbers were actually pretty bad. And that's why there's so much concern and talk about it.
That's interesting. And I think a lot of people are wondering how much exactly these DOGE cuts are contributing to this.
About a third. So of that 172,000 number, it was roughly 62,000 and change that were coming from the DOGE layoffs. Now, of course, expect next month when we get this data again, that to also be a big component because those layoffs were ongoing. But there were a couple of other sectors that also spiked: retail, technology, consumer products. And the reasons that they gave were economic conditions, fear of inflation. Also, we had a lot of bankruptcies in the retail space. So it wasn't just DOGE, but that was a big contributor.
And, you know, we've all been watching the stock market in terms of Trump's tariff plan, but I'm wondering if this has any impact on the stock market. Could we see it there?
Yeah, if you were watching the stock market, I mean, you were on a roller coaster today in the past couple of days. So you're right that most of this was tariffs and just the uncertainty in general. But this morning, these numbers came out and there was a big drop because there is a lot of uncertainty about where the labor market is. We've also seen consumer spending pull back. There are fears of inflation. And as we think about the Federal Reserve and there's an interest rate decision in the next couple of weeks, if you have rising inflation and a slowing job market or a lot of layoffs, that's going to be a really tough decision for them to make.
All right, we will continue to keep an eye on that volatile market. Kelly O'Grady, thank you as always for breaking this down for us. We appreciate it. Chemtrails, Biden body doubles, and a global cabal. How some are led to believe the unbelievable. A first-hand account of the impact of the spread of disinformation and what it could have. You're streaming, you're watching America Decides. The spread of misinformation, especially on social media, is giving rise to fringe conspiracy theories that have no basis in reality. In a new piece for NPR, Zach Mack shares his family's journey as his father's far-right views led him down a path of falsehoods and fictional beliefs about the political world. Mack writes, quote, "Like so many Americans, Dad had gotten swept up in conspiracy theories, chemtrails, Biden body doubles, the idea that a shadowy cabal he calls the globalists is secretly running the world." And Zach Mack joins us now. Zach, thanks so much for being here. And we so appreciate your article and the way in which you share so much about your family and how you are sorting through all of this as well. In the piece, you mentioned that your father started to kind of pick up some of this around the time of COVID. Can you kind of walk us through how this really began?
Yeah, I mean, going back, he's definitely always been sort of distrusting of institutions and skeptical of vaccines, and he's deeply religious. And I think in 2019 he started to say things like Mark Zuckerberg didn't really create Facebook and stuff like that. And then, you know, like so many people during the pandemic, a lot of people got radicalized, especially around, you know, COVID conspiracy theories and things like that. So that's really, I think, where it picked up for a lot of people. And he started to believe in things called like online prophets, these people who claim to commune directly with God, and they often are spreading right-wing, like, you know, conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and you start off the article by talking about this bet that you made with your father.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about that, kind of what happened and how it ended.
Yeah, so the last couple of years, he's been getting more and more into these conspiracy theories. And about a year ago, over Christmas, things sort of came to a head. And I challenged him. I said, hey, I think you're being radicalized. I work in media. I know how this goes. He didn't believe me. And so what he did next was he challenged me to a bet for $10,000, which is more money than either of us have ever. We're not gamblers and we're not rich. So that was surprising to me. He challenged me to a bet saying these 10 predictions will all happen by the end of 2024. And when they do, you'll understand that I'm right and you don't know what you're talking about. And I said, okay, you're on. And I took a look at the list, and it was all very politically apocalyptic predictions. He was sort of predicting that, top Democrats like Obama and Biden and Pelosi would be rounded up and convicted of treason, that our country would come under martial law, that Trump would be reinstated without an election, stuff like that. And I was just like, I didn't think that was going to happen. So I took that bet in hopes to be able to kind of change his mind when it was over a year from then.
And did you?
Unfortunately, I did not, but I did learn a lot about him and a lot about conspiracy theories and how these ideas sort of take hold and what their appeal is. But yeah, no, I was unable to convince him. Like so many sort of doomsday cults or big predictions and prophets, he sort of gave the same excuse, which is that he just got the timeline wrong.
What was so interesting about your piece, too, is that you're also reporting through it. You're talking to your dad. You're talking to other members of your family. You also were talking to a lot of experts to kind of get their advice or information about this. And I'm curious what you heard from them.
Yeah, they all say the same thing, which is that it's really hard, that these ideas are incredibly insidious. And once someone kind of goes down that rabbit hole, it's really hard to get them out. But that ultimately, the more you approach the situation with curiosity, with empathy, and really try to get under the hood and understand what are these ideas doing for them. Because I mistakenly thought my father just had the wrong facts. And if I just gave him the correct facts, then he'd be on his way. But that's just not how it works. And it's about understanding what these ideas are doing for him.
Yeah, and you also talk about the impact this has had on your family. You talk to your sister and your mother. What kind of impact has this had on everyone? Because I think the point that at least I took away from is that these kinds of theories, once they take root, it doesn't just affect the person that is, beholden to them. It kind of affects everyone around them.
Yeah, I think his relationship with everyone in our family has deteriorated quite a bit. It's also, for my mom, it's hard to share a home with someone who you don't share reality with. And, he's doing things like spending money on precious metals and survivalist supplies because he thinks the grid is going to get taken out. And, it's one thing to be prepared. It's another thing to be, paranoid and spending money that you don't need. It all adds up very quickly. And it's been extremely difficult for the family.
Well, Zach, we really appreciate you sharing this with us and with a big audience through the piece. It was really fascinating to kind of get inside the mind, and you handle it so delicately. And it was, fascinating to see. And I think so many people can relate to it, knowing someone going through this as well. So thank you so much for your time in reporting, and we're wishing you and your family all the best.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me.
And that does it for us today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.